I'm ready, Freddie.
Okay, so thank you for agreeing to do this fun little idea for a podcast.
Sure.
Uh, so I, we, you were you found out about me through Mormon book reviews. I did that one where I made the claim that Latter-day Saints are existentialists, and then you roasted me in the comment section and
Right.
telling me to go read Heidegger and go get a more basic understanding of philosophy. So
Right.
that was a great meet right there. And then we had a couple of back and forth emails, and then we had a little bit of a Google Meet before this to talk about things a little bit more in general. But
hmm
so, how are you doing in today, sir?
I'm good, thank you.
You are very good. Okay, awesome. So, why don't you talk a little bit about yourself? What's your background? What got you into philosophy?
So I have a JD and I have an MA. My MA is in philosophy. My specialty is 20th century Franco-German thought, specifically phenomenology.
Okay.
So all the stuff with deconstruction and postmodernism,
Hmm.
all the buzzwords that you hear, that's what I do, that stuff. So that, I guess. And so when I went to my undergraduate was in BYU. And so that was my first introduction, I guess, to the formal study. And then graduate school, what have you, proceeded from there. So I guess like
Hmm.
that.
Like that. That's how it is. Okay. Awesome. So one thing I wanted to ask you about, we've been talking a little bit about what is exactly a philosopher. You were talking to me about what the difference is between a theologian and a philosopher, and it got me sort of thinking. All of our conversations in general have gotten me thinking about how we live in this day and age with the internet, how everybody suddenly thinks they're instantly this expert on things. But we were talking about how understanding things, especially philosophy, really takes marinating, like the example you gave of cows with two stomachs. And so what would you say is the primary difference between somebody that likes to think they are a philosopher and somebody that actually is one? What who's the why the difference between a philosopher and a pseudo intellectual, I guess you could say. Somebody who just got watched a couple of YouTube videos on philosophy and read a couple of Stoic quotes on Instagram, and suddenly, what is the difference between that person and a real philosopher?
Um, well, maybe we should begin with the definition of the word itself.
Sure.
So, how would you define philosophy?
Hmm.
Um, Typically, people would approach this etymologically, and it's a Greek word, and it has two parts to it. The prefix comes from philia, which is a Greek word for love, and the suffix comes from another Greek word, which is wisdom, right?
Okay.
So then the question is, why did the Greeks go with those two particular elements to talk about this discipline? Because in Greek, there are a number of words for love. Philia is the word we normally associate with friendship, but there's a whole host of other words, such as eros, which like romantic love,
Right.
or storge,
I'm still
which
working on that aspect of my
still
life.
working on that.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I'm
yeah.
on all the dating apps, but they're not working so far.
It will come.
All right.
But then there's like storge, which is, say,
Mhm.
parental love, or mania, which is like an obsessive love, right? Where you're
Right.
consumed by the object of your affection. Um, we could go with agape, which is what we often associate with charity, right? In religious discourse, which is kind of an unbounded universal. Love.
Is that the word they use for charity in the scriptures? Is agape? Okay.
Correct. And see, the Greeks don't use that in this discipline at all,
Mhm.
right? So the question is, why did they go with philia? So there's a number. There's like 8 different words for love in Greek that we can go through, right? Philoutia, which is like self-love. So there's a bunch of them. Why did they go with philia, which I said is mostly associated with friendship, but it also has a
Right. Like the
component
city
of,
of Philadelphia is the city of
yeah, the city
brotherly
of
love.
brotherly love. Correct.
That's where I
So,
serve my mission. So I'm very
yeah, is
familiar
it?
with that place. Yeah.
Okay, great.
Mhm.
I serve my mission in Japan, so a little bit farther away.
すごい。
話せるのか？ちょっと習ってた？日本語。
ちょっとわかります。
That's
Yeah.
good. That's good.
I lived in Japan for a year, and so I know a little bit of Japanese, and I'm still trying to study it.
That's great.
難しいでしょ
いや、日本語は難しいですよ。かなり英語と離れてるから、文法的には。So, I understand. It's tough. Yeah. So, why did they go with philia? And particularly if we say that it's tied to friendship, right? How does that relate to the discipline? One of the components of philia is that it applies to an orientation, right?
Okay.
So it has something that it is fixed to, that it is oriented toward. And this tells us something else about the Greek mind, which is that there is an object or a concept that is being aligned with, but that is separate and distinct from the person. So in Greek thought, within its aesthetics and a whole host of other elements, there is a mimetic quality. Do you want me to explain that?
Sure.
Okay, so there's the Greek word mimesis, which is the informing concept that you find in all aesthetics, which is basically to imitate. So if you think about Greek sculpture and the ways that men and women are presented, right? There is a form, there is an ideal that is being looked to or toward to match, and it applies all across the Greek space. That also is in the theoretical arena, which is that which is best, that which is virtuous, exists independent of my views on the subject. And so I have to align myself with the perfect. I have to align myself with the good. That's why philia has value, because it suggests that orientation towards something that is beyond the self. And then the onus is on me to bring an accord with that thing. I can't just invent it. It is there independent of my will. So that tells us something about the philia part. But then there's the suffix, sophia, which is what? Which has to do with wisdom. Okay, so it's an alignment with wisdom. Now you can ask, well, why did they say like a philosophe as opposed to a soph, right? Why is it a philosopher instead of someone who is, well, I went with the Greek, a soph, right? One who has that already. And the reason is because sophia for the Greeks is tied to the divine, that which is complete. And we as men are not that. We are a metaxy. We're sort of an in-between. If we put this into LDS terms, we could think about it from, say, the Book of Mormon. We're in a probationary state.
Okay.
Right? We are not final. We are a work in process. And so the philosophe is someone who has a conception of the good, recognizes its value, and is in a pursuit of that thing, but he has not gotten it, right? He is not perfect. He aspires towards that, right? So that's why that probationary, the metaxy, might work, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
So we're working towards that Sophia.
Right. And so Sophia as wisdom, we can also compare it, say, with another Greek word, because there's a whole bunch of Greek words for knowledge, right? Like episteme or techne or pronesis. Pronesis also has an ethical component like sophia. So why didn't they say philopronesis? And the reason is because pronesis is a practical understanding of how to do an X, Y, or Z thing, whereas sophia is before that. And so again, if I were to put this in LDS terms, we could think about the light of Christ, right? Something that is prior to the self, that is informing my judgments and understanding of the good. Sophia has that component. It exists before me, it informs me, and it stands beyond me, something that I must align with.
Right.
So the philosopher is engaged in that project, an understanding of the good and an aspiration towards the good. Whereas, say, like pronesis has a more pragmatic feel to it, that I know how to do a particular thing. Whereas sophia is prior to that.
Sure.
So the philosopher is engaged in that project. And then it becomes a question of how is that done? And in the Greek tradition, that is tied to the use and appeal to reason. And reason,
right, and that's the one difference that you were trying to tell me of, that differentiates a philosopher from a theologian.
Correct. So a theologian, by definition, is somebody who is going to accept a whole set of assumptions tied to the tradition of which they are a part of, right? So if you're a Christian, that means recognizing that there is a God, recognizing that Jesus is the Christ, and then you have to flush all of that out. The philosophical perspective only has one assumption, which is that reason is a vehicle to apprehend the true. No other assumption is given automatic standing. And rather, all of those would be brought into a type of criticism. And by criticism, I don't mean attack, but rather understanding the limits of the concepts that are being employed and whether or not they should apply or do not apply. And that is done through rational analysis. And rationality is logic, which is an invention of the Greeks.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. It all goes back to the Greeks. Like, what was it about that certain atmosphere that they grew up in, where like you literally get so many defining aspects of Western civilization from the Greeks? You know, they're the ones that came up with the Olympics, but they're also the ones that are like the foundation of philosophy, and they were really great with math and science. And it's like, what was it about the Greeks that they suddenly had this burst of intelligence?
That's an interesting question, and there are a variety of answers to that. I am sympathetic to the idea that one of the things that makes the Greeks what they are, well, I'll bring up two factors. One of them is geopolitical. When we think about the Greek world, it is not unified. You have a whole host of city-states that are competing against each other and with other ethnicities for survival and a whole host of other things. And competition breeds excellence, because that which cannot compete will not survive. Whereas if you think of, say, the surrounding civilized peoples that the Greeks are dealing with, whether we're talking, depending on how far back we want to go, if we're thinking about the Achaemenids, right, the Persians, or the Egyptians, or if we want to go farther back, the Hittites, or into the Mesopotamian space where we've got the Assyrians and the Babylonians, what have you. You have these large polities that coalesce, and in and through that coalescence, you're going to have a certain type of flattening, right? In the religious space, in the intellectual space. That doesn't happen with the Greeks. They are disparate and competing against each other. And then there's the great Peloponnesian War between the Delian League, led by the Athenians, versus the Spartans, the Peloponnesian League, which lasts 27 years, right? Where they're in competition, literal warfare with each other, which ultimately bleeds them to the point that they are now, eventually they get conquered by the Macedonians, which leads to Alexander the Great. right? All of that stuff, before that competition, that allows an openness for creativity and intellectual investigation that I don't know you could really do as effectively if, say, you were living under the pharaohs, where there is an established order of things. And we can use the Egyptians as an example when we think of, say, like Akhenaten, who tries to create a new system, right? The attained, which a lot of people will associate with an early version of monotheism, but it does not survive him. After he dies, there is a reversal, right?
Wasn't that the earliest form of monotheism?
That's what a lot of people will argue. And but he fails, right?
Okay.
After he and his wife Nefertiri die, I mean, he moves and creates a new capital city in Egypt because he's trying to remove the power of the priestly class and create a whole new model, but it doesn't survive. After he dies, everything goes back. And then his son, which is Tutankhamun, right? He's just a little boy under the control of these other elements. And then things go back. So that's kind of an example, which you don't really have with the Greeks. So that's number one. The other that I would cite would be linguistic, that there's something about Indo-European languages and their construction that lends itself towards a speculative model that is harder to do in other languages. Because, and here again, we can think of the great civilizations, and there's really only two that develop advanced, sophisticated metaphysical systems. One are the Greeks, and the other comes out of the subcontinent, who are also Indo-European speakers, right? We know about the Aryan invasions and their conquest of what would become India. Those are the same fellows that develop the sophisticated systems that we find both within Buddhist and Hindu thought. Only those two. Everywhere else, you don't have that. And the Indians try to develop a type of logic, but it doesn't have the sophistication of the Greeks, and it has failures that the Greeks overcame. So the Greeks development of reason, right? Coming out of the inventor of deductive logic is a guy named Parmenides, and he comes from the Pythagorean school, who are studying mathematics, particularly geometry. And then he takes that and then he uses that to develop what becomes the first logical system, which is deductive logic. And that's what, say, Plato uses. And then you've got fellows like Aristotle who create the beginnings of what becomes inductive logic. And then you've got fellows like Chrysippus, the Stoics, who invent propositional logic. All of that comes out of the Greek tradition, and it's unique. And it allows them to have a model of intellectual discourse that is immune to political or religious assumptions. And it has a force independent of that. So, and that happens, I think, on a certain level because of the linguistic orientation that you've got within the Greek space that you don't have with other advanced peoples. So that's maybe a long-winded response. Those two, right? The geopolitical arena and the linguistic arena that create a bedrock through which the Greeks can become what they did.
And then I was thinking about how it kind of sounds like something similar kind of happened with Germany, you know, because we get a lot of German intellectuals out of Germany too. There was lots of like Protestantism was a thing, and the Gutenberg press was making books more easily accessible. So there was a lot of different ideas going around, lots of different trying to understand, different competing religions and lots of competing ideas all mixing together, where you get Kant, you get Nietzsche, and then later you get Heidegger, all those guys.
Right. So you can even go a step bigger and use that same model to answer the question, why is it that Europe became the dominant global civilization? Mm-hmm. And if we go back to prior to the advent of modernity, say, the very beginnings of the 16th century, say 1500, right? Luther is going to do his 95 Theses in 1517. So if we go back just a few years before that and we look at what Western Europe was like and then compare it with the other great civilizations, we have the Ottomans, we have the Mughals in India, we have at that time the Ming Dynasty, we have these massive, well-established civilizational models, whereas Europe, it's diffuse, right? The Habsburgs and the Valois or the Bourbons all competing against each other. The Holy Roman Empire, right? The Germans that you were referencing, all of that. What is the key demarcation? That Europe was not unified. So you have competition. You can also do this with the Renaissance, with Italy, right? The city-states, all in competition with each other. So under that thesis, and this is something that was developed by the historian Daniel Boorstin, which I am sympathetic to, is that competition breeds a superior product. And so you can apply that to why Europe became what it did, right? Gunpowder, a lot of these inventions didn't come from Europe. They come from outside of Europe, but the Europeans then take it and use it and move it in a different direction, right? The printing press, paper, that predates the Europeans, but then other things happen. So the Europeans are able to do things with invention or discovery or rediscovery or amending of other things that come from outside them that you don't see elsewhere. So yeah, I think that's right. And that kind of feeds into it. And it's the same with the Germans, right? The Second Reich doesn't develop until 1871. So prior to that, you've got all this competition. The Reformation that you mentioned, that's another example, right? Exactly.
Exactly, yeah. And so, I mean, to bring it back to Mormonism, a problem that I feel like is going around is I feel like we missed that fire we had back in the days of Joseph Smith and Brigham Young, with all the competing ideas that were going around, trying to figure out what exactly was this restored gospel idea that they were doing. And it's become very institutionalized, and everybody is getting up and giving the same talks and sacrament meeting, and everybody's saying prayers the same way. Please bless this food that'll nourish and strengthen my body. And everybody really sticks super close to the Gospel Library app and what the prophets are saying. But I really want to try to push this, like, we need to be looking outside the church and be reading Buddhist philosophy, Stoicism, existentialist books, just a whole bunch of other like ideas that are going around that would greatly benefit us, and hopefully reignite like those similar situations that were going on in Greece and Germany, and really, bring back that fire.
I understand what you're saying. We have to ask the question, though, why is that the case? Why is there this harmonization in the church? And we can't simply just poo-poo it. I think that there are reasons, and a hostility or a type of resistance within the larger church to speculative thought, I think, has been normative from at least the early 1930s up into the 21st century. Why is that? And we could point to people, say, like Joseph Fielding Smith or his son-in-law, Bruce R. McConkie, who were both strong personalities who had hostility towards speculative thinking. We can go that direction. And they were able to imprint onto the membership, to a certain extent, a model to engage the scriptures that had a ripple effect. We could go that route, but we can also just look at the scriptures themselves, right? So let me give you an example or two. It's easy. I made a couple notes and guessing where you might want to go. So if we look in the scriptures, we can go with things like from the New Testament, 1 Timothy 6:21 or 20 and 21. Oh, Timothy, guard what was committed to your trust, avoiding the profane and idle babblings and contradictions of what is falsely called knowledge. By professing it, some have strayed concerning the faith. Right? Or Colossians 2:8. See to it that no one captivate you with empty seductive philosophy according to human tradition, according to the elemental powers of the world, and not according to Christ. Or we can go to the Book of Mormon, 2 Nephi 9:28 and 29. Oh, that cunning plan of the evil one. Oh, the vainness and the frailties and the foolishness of men. When they are learned, they think they are wise, and they hearken not unto the counsel of God. For they set it aside, supposing they know of themselves, wherefore their wisdom is foolishness, and it profiteth them not, and they shall perish. Right? And there's a whole bunch of scriptures like that. So the question that arises is, does a member of the church need to be philosophically grounded? And if you say yes, then how do you deal with those verses? And if you say no, then why bother with philosophy to begin with? And that's kind of a basic question. So we have, if my reading of history is right, and I went from, let's say, the 1930s forward, where there has been this aversion to speculative thinking, I think that those scriptures kind of lend support to that. If I'm a standard member of the church, why do I want to go that direction? And to the degree that I go that direction, am I susceptible then to the hubris that comes from thinking I know things that I don't actually know? And the thrust of the church, right? Because you're a returned missionary, as am I. When we engage members, is it all about intellectual acuity and erudition? Is that how people are brought to Christ? It's not, right? It's about a testimony. And how do you get a testimony? Is it an intellectual process or not? And
I think it's a little bit of an intellectual and spiritual process.
Okay. So if we say that, if we're saying that there are two elements to that,
it's like, I think it's the Doctrine and Covenants that emphasizes mind and heart.
Yeah. Right. So if we want to say that, then we can't just poo-poo a certain wariness to an overthinking of things or an over-reliance on the intellect. So I can understand why there would be that reticence. So like as I mentioned, when I did my undergraduate work long time ago at BYU, there were maybe 10 philosophy majors at BYU. It was like tiny, right? It was not an area that people went into. My old boss, Truman Madsen, he was the guy that got a philosophy department reestablished at BYU. It was through him, where prior to him, there wasn't one. So you have to kind of understand that. And I think that kind of makes sense. So if we're going to justify why a member of the church would want to go into this space, we have to put it into those terms. And we can't simply say, those guys don't understand that we are now the holders of what is. That's dangerous. Right?
You don't want that kind of hubris.
Right. So if we go with what you said, which is it is a combination between the mind and the spirit, that's the way that we should always approach it, understand it in those terms. And from our previous conversations where we brought up here a little bit, there is a difference between philosophy and theology. And so if you're going to do speculative theology, that means that we are working after certain baseline assumptions about Jesus being the Christ, about the validity of the restoration, and then we are working within those parameters. If we're just doing straight philosophy, then all of those things come into question, and it means you're doing it's a different project.
Okay.
And so I think a lot of the general authorities see that other space as something that can be detrimental. If you are going to just cast aside what you have experienced or what you know via the Holy Ghost, you're on dangerous ground, and you need to be aware of that. And you could
Okay.
become susceptible to your own arrogance. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay.
That's probably one of the defining features of a lot of secularist philosophies. You know,
Yeah.
they're they're trying to reason with the world, but do it without the Holy Spirit, do it without God, and it usually runs into lots of errors. I mean, I don't want to be extreme, but one might say World War II was a result of that, of like, you know, that death of God and people trying to just think strictly intellectually without compassion, without the Spirit, and it led them into really dark territories.
Yeah, I think that we can extrapolate from what you said the dangers of dogmatism,
Hmm. Oh
right?
yeah, I
If
don't know
you
if anybody was more dogmatic than Nazi Germany.
well, I think the communists give them a good
Yeah, the
competitive.
communists too. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, dogmatism has dangers that are implicit
Hmm.
in it. Anybody who becomes an ideologue is in dangerous territory. And I think what's interesting and the YouTube space that you participate in is I see that there is a rising group of LDS apologists who
Yeah.
seem to be maybe Gen Z or Gen Z adjacent, right? A
Yeah.
younger crop of members of the
I'm
church.
just right on that border.
Yeah.
Consider myself a millennial, but because I
Okay.
was born in '96, and then some people say Gen Z starts in '97, so I'm kind of the youngest millennial.
Right there. Yeah. So from my perspective, I see a lot of these LDS apologists that want to defend the church against anti-Mormon attacks, which are
Sure.
pervasive. But a lot of them
I
are
mean, there has been quite an interesting rise of anti-Mormonism on YouTube and other spaces.
sure, sure.
So
So it's
it's
understandable, right?
definitely, yeah, understandable and very courageous to want to try to defend your beliefs.
However, an
Hmm.
apologia is by definition a defense.
Right, that's what it is.
Whereas I see a lot of figures in that area that are going on the offense. They are attacking uh, the other side of the equation, and they're maybe sarcastic or really aggressive. And I wonder how that plays out for people that are not LDS. It a lot of these rising apologists are a little too self-congratulatory, and they it kind of goes with what you were saying. There's sort of a ad veracundium fallacy, which is
Mhm.
that the fallacy of where you know a little bit about one thing and then you assume that because of that that you can speak authoritatively on other subjects, which is problematic. And it doesn't seem to me like a lot of these fellows have any formal training in logic or the larger intellectual tradition. Rather, they simply want to defend the church, and so they know a little bit, and then they go after traditional Christian positions, whether it's Calvinism or what have you. But then they start moving forward, and then they're like attacking these other faiths, and
Mhm.
I think that's kind of troubling.
They all want to follow that. I think, wasn't it Paul that said that to always be prepared to give an answer whenever somebody asks to
Right.
when it comes to the gospel.
Sure.
So
Wanting to explain.
they all want to be that righteous warrior who has that answer and wants to respond to all these criticisms.
Right. But there's a difference between wanting to give an answer
Hmm.
for what you understand via the Spirit and being a crusader.
Sure.
And I wonder if some of these people are moving in that direction, and that's a little bit worrying to me.
Right. We don't need a repeat of the Crusades.
Right. Intellectually or
Mhm.
otherwise.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Definitely. So how do we balance that out if we really want to study, get into those heavy intellectual texts, but then at the same time be feel like we are able to defend our beliefs without it coming across as hubris, without us falling into that crusader mentality.
So we were talking a little bit about the meaning of philosophy, and I was going into a little bit about filia and sophia. And I was mentioning when I was talking about filia that it has an orientation to it, but it also has an embedded type of humility. And I think that's key. So I think that members of the church that want to engage in this space or want to understand further should always have a baseline humility, and that they should embrace fully, say, the 13th article of faith, which is that we should look for the true wherever it lay and not be afraid to pursue that. But that is an augment to the testimony that we have received. That is an augment to the understanding that we have through the restored gospel. It is not meant to be a replacement of it, and that we do not rely on it over and above what we learn, say, in primary.
Mm-hmm. Those primary foundational truths.
Yeah.
Always go back to the basics. That's what all those kung fu masters are always telling you, to get those basics down. Always rely on the basics, because they're your foundation for a reason.
Right. I think that's right. I mean, are you reading the scriptures regularly? Are you involved in daily prayer? And if not, and you're just spending all your time reading Nietzsche, that might be an issue.
Yeah, that's
because the interpretive lens will be changed. Okay. Right? You should engage the larger intellectual traditions, not just from the West, but from the East and elsewhere. But do it through the lens of the restored gospel, and you will benefit. And if you abandon that, then you have put yourself into a different position, and that can lead to error. That's what I would say. As a member of the church, right? As somebody that wants to engage the larger intellectual traditions, I think that's the framing that it should follow.
Mm-hmm. Okay, awesome. And then talking a little bit more about my own sort of, that's me. I probably read too much Nietzsche. I got my Thus Spoke Zarathustra book on my desk there. Yeah. But yeah, I definitely need to be engaging more with the scriptures and stuff and the standard works. I remember thinking it was such an awesome thing that I managed to go through all of it on my mission. Read the whole thing. I had my book, my Bible, my quad, I guess you could say, all marked up. I had this super awesome marking system going on. It has been a second since I marked in that. So I should probably get back into that. That's kind of
telling, right? If you're not engaging the texts, why not?
Yeah.
And I'm a big fan of Nietzsche too. I think he's really interesting, right? I think he's wrong on some really basic points, but he's right on some really interesting points as well. And you find that across the board, all through the great philosophical tradition that starts with the Greeks forward. There's a lot of great stuff in there. So I commend you for engaging that writer. And there are a lot others out there. But I think that the real benefit will be in it marrying itself up with what you understand through the Holy Ghost, through the restored gospel, as opposed to being in a replacement. And if it becomes a replacement, that's where the errors lay. Sure,
definitely. That's definitely something that I need to look out for. So I want to talk a little bit more about I make a lot of claims about Latter-day Saints being existentialists, and then you came in and said, I don't know what I'm talking about when it comes to existentialism, and you told me to go read Heidegger and stuff like that, and especially that. And so I have been thinking a lot about that kind of stuff. But if not existentialism, how would you frame Mormon philosophy? Like, supposing everything about Mormonism is true, the premortal life I think is a big one. The three kingdoms of glory, our idea of God. What sort of philosophy would you derive from general Mormon theology?
I don't think. Well, Going off of what I said earlier, I don't think there is a Mormon philosophy because by definition, it's going to be a theology because it is going to accept certain baseline assumptions that would not be the case if it were a purely philosophical posture.
Okay.
So it's not. And I would also call into question the very idea of a Mormon theology because on a basic level that we find in the Articles of Faith, we do not have a locked in, final, encapsulated position. We believe in ongoing revelation, which means things can and do change.
Sure.
We do not have the equivalent of the Roman Catholic Catechism that is an exhaustive, authoritative listing of the X, Y, and Z of what we believe.
Right. From what I understand, Joseph Smith wanted to get away from stuff like that.
Well, I think it's unavoidable because if we believe in ongoing revelation, things can and do change, and we should expect that. I would further argue that on a baseline level, the restored gospel is an orthopraxy, not an orthodoxy. And do you understand the difference when I say that?
Could you explain the difference?
Okay, so when I say orthodoxy, it means right belief, right? Because doxa in the Greek has to do with an understanding or a belief of things. We don't, and an orthopraxy has to do with behavior or what you do. We do have certain baseline truth claims that we make, but I would cite maybe the baptismal interview or the interview that one goes through to get your temple recommend. The questions that are asked, some of them are baseline affirmations like accepting Jesus the Christ, Joseph Smith as a prophet, things, recognizing modern day prophets. But a lot of the questions are tied to what you do, the law of chastity, paying your tithes, right? They're behavioral in their orientation. Even the Articles of Faith, there's only 13 of them. That's not very many, right? So I think that in many ways, the restored gospel has a lot of parallels with, say, Judaism, which I also think is orthopraxic.
Right. It's extremely Jewish. Like the more I look into it.
So I think
if you went back and talked to an Israelite, I don't know, around 1000 BC, they probably would have no idea if you tried to, what you were talking about, if you tried to talk to them about Christian theology, about like the Trinity and stuff like that. And
well, I don't even have to go back that far. We can just look at rabbinic Judaism.
Sure.
And the rabbinic tradition itself has a whole host of opinions and ideas, the midrash, what have you, on the particularities of the faith. And I think that within the restored gospel, we have the space for that, where people can engage in good faith on what they think the meaning of a particular position may be, or what its conclusions may lead to, none of which necessarily call into the question their devotion to the gospel.
Okay.
Right. So, for example, evolution. We do not have an authoritative position on that. I mean, there are a multitude of general authorities that have very strong views on that.
Sure.
Say, Talmage versus Joseph Fielding Smith, which are polar opposites on
Right.
where they came down.
Talmage believed in it, and Fielding Smith didn't.
Correct. Right. And Joseph Fielding Smith was really hostile towards that idea. So that's an example. There is an open space there.
I definitely don't think we should be looking at the general authorities of the church as like historians or scientists or anything like that. They're strictly moral guides, I think.
Well, a prophet can speak on any subject.
Sure, any
He's not
subject.
bound to just the ethical. It
depends on his. It probably depends on his background, but
it depends on if he's speaking as a prophet or not.
Yeah, that's true.
Right? If he comes out and says, "I have had a revelation concerning X," that itself is self-justifying, as opposed to an opinion on a particular matter. And we can make a distinction between the two, and I think that's fine. But a prophet can speak on anything authoritatively. They are not limited to simply the moral space. However, as I said, I think that the gospel is fundamentally orthopraxic, which means it has that openness, and we're not limited to a particular ideological posture. And people that want to go that direction, I think, can make mistakes. That is much of traditional Christianity is orthodoxic because it assumed a Hellenistic position. As the Hellenization of Christianity occurred after the apostasy, it necessarily moved in that direction, and it has never been able to get out of that space.
Yeah, I remember that episode you did with Stick of Joseph, where you were talking about how stoic the New Testament is, how there's all of these Greek ideas in it, and that's something you see with not just the Stoic influence in it. There's also like Dionysian influences and Hercules influences in it. So the New Testament is a very, very Greek thing, it seems like.
And so in that episode, I brought up the question of how is it that we learn something on the question of revelation. Do you recall what I talked about in regards to, I gave a Platonic model off of the dialogue Ion. Do you remember that? Do you want me to flesh that out?
Yeah, could you flesh that out a little bit more?
Okay, so what I brought up was, how is it that understanding of the true can be manifest? And I referenced the Platonic dialogue Ion, where you have Socrates as the protagonist. He engages with a fellow named Ion, who is a rhapsode. And a rhapsode in classical Greek was, or in classical Greece, was a singer, kind of like a bard, a medieval bard. They would sing, it would be poetry. That's what he did. That was how he earned his way. And Ion was a singer for Zeus. And in the dialogue, Socrates is asking him about, how does that work? How do you go about that? And he explains, meaning Ion, that the muses reveal to him the truth, and then he expresses it. So he's like a funnel, that the muses come to him, they give him the right words, and then he expresses it. So he's simply the vehicle through which that is manifest. So that is one way to understand revelation, that the revelator is this device that something is expressed, as opposed to a different model, which would be that the revelator is himself occupying a certain socio-linguistic space, and that informs the way that he would understand things. So you, as a 21st century American, would necessarily understand an engagement with revelation differently from, say, Paul, who is a citizen of the Roman Empire in the first century. The assumptions, the language, the cultural background are different, which means that you're going to understand things differently.
That's why it's dangerous to apply a modern context to ancient scriptures, which is something that we do a lot.
Right.
And so, not just scriptures, but ancient texts in general.
Correct.
It's like, so I can't remember who said it, but they were like, oh, the past is an alien world of some kind.
Yeah, exactly. It is an undiscovered country. You can say that for the future too, the undiscovered country, right? That's from Shakespeare. Right.
Okay.
So the two scriptures that I brought up in support of that, one would be out of D&C 1:24, right? Behold, I am God and I have spoken it. These commandments are of me and were given unto my servants in their weakness, after the manner of their language, that they might come to an understanding. And then another one would be Alma 29:8, for behold, the Lord doth grant unto all nations of their own nation and tongue to teach his word in wisdom all that he seeth fit that they should have. Therefore, we see that the Lord doth counsel in wisdom according to that which is just and true. So in both of those, revelation is being recognized as occurring within a linguistic context. and language is necessarily culturally informed. So I used that in that podcast to push what I was arguing is that revelation always occurs within a cultural context, that there is never this space that is undiluted where the pure revelation comes and then it is expressed. That I don't think that's possible. That insofar as we are imperfect as humans, that when the divine reveals itself, there's going to be some type of filtering, that we can't avoid that. And so I think that also applies. I think that applies universally. And so the disciples that are writing the epistles that become the New Testament, they are writing in a cultural context. When Joseph Smith is putting together and creating the Book of Mormon, he's doing that under a 19th century context.
Sure. That's why the Book of Mormon feels so American.
Well, why does it that he uses Jamesian English, right?
Right. He uses
King
James English. I always thought that was a funny criticism from the CES letter. Oh, why is he using King James Bible in English? Well, that's because that's the Bible. That's the scriptural language he grew up with.
That's the language.
That's what he would have recognized as, that most people back then would have recognized as, this is God speaking, pay attention.
Right. So it makes sense as a creature of the 19th century and their family Bible being the King James, that's the natural language that he would adopt for the elevated prose or verse that he's bringing forth as the Book of Mormon. It naturally would be the case, and it would be weird if it was something other than that. So all of that fits within a cultural context. So that's kind of the argument that I made in that podcast, and I think that's the case universally.
Okay.
That revelation is always going to be under that vein.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense.
So you were asking what philosophy fits. I don't think that the restored gospel has a philosophy. I think that we are fundamentally orthopraxic and that we have liberty to engage the larger intellectual traditions, whether it be the Western traditions or something from the East, at our leisure, and we can gain benefit from them.
Sure.
But it always should be through the lens of what we have learned via the restored gospel, via the mouthpieces of the Lord, via our own spiritual experiences. And it is not a replacement, but it is an augment to those things.
Sure.
And those remain fundamental. And the other are then brought in as a device to further understand, but never to replace.
Sure. And it's probably not something that you would be wanting to categorize.
Correct. And I think categorization would be a mistake. So if I want to engage Nietzsche, say, I can do that in a full-throated fashion, gleaning and ruminating as on his work as needed, but not as a replacement.
Okay. Right. That makes sense. I wanted to just real quick talk a little bit more about Heidegger. I think I've been reading a lot more about him since you brought him up in that comic section.
Yeah.
So been rereading a lot of things. Could you briefly explain what it is? So his whole thing seems to be about critiquing how, like, atheist philosophers before him, like Sartre and Nietzsche, talking about how they're these atheist philosophers, but they're still playing within the metaphysical sandbox that previous theological philosophers like Kierkegaard or St. Thomas Aquinas were playing in. Is that correct?
So when we initially started to engage, one of my critiques of your fawning over existentialism is that if you want to do that, you have to understand what existentialism entails. And
Sure.
I put forward, I went off of the Sartrean position, right? I consider Sartre as the quintessential existentialist. Even though he did not invent the term, he eventually adopted it as his own for his position. Sure. And under his lectures, he puts forward that existentialism, he has the position that existentialism is existence over essence.
Mm-hmm.
And,
Existence precedes essence, whereas
right,
before it was essence precedes existence.
right. Do you want me to flesh that out, or are we good with what that means?
I think that's a basic understanding. It's sort of a reference to ex nihilo creation. God thought of your essence before he created you. Sort of like, doesn't it go back to like Aristotle talking about like his metaphysics, talking about the knife, like the blade is the was originally conceived as the essence before it was created, sort of a thing.
You've been doing some reading of Sartre. That's a Sartrean metaphor.
Right.
Yeah. So essence means.
I definitely think I've got too much Sartre up here.
Yeah, I can see it in there. Essence refers to the fundamental thing that makes categorization possible. So if we talk about humanity, the essence of humanity would be that fundamental aspect of the concept that is universally applicable to anything that fits within that category.
Okay.
Whereas existence prioritizes the cogito, the individual thing over and above the category itself, that it is divorced from and independent from categorization. And that is a Sartrean position.
Okay.
Okay. So when you read Being and Nothingness, or his, which he wrote and put out in 1945, that's what he's doing, is that the individual as an individual is primary, and that it is not dependent upon nor informed by any type of categorization. Rather, it is engaged with the existential question itself, which is what it is to be and how that should be understood. That is a Sartrean position. And Heidegger fundamentally rejects Sartre. And Sartre was somebody who was working off of Heideggerian formulae, but in my view,
he wrote Being and Nothingness after reading Being and Time.
Correct. And I don't think he understood it. And Heidegger didn't think he understood it either. And he wrote a response to Sartre in his 1946 essay.
I wouldn't be surprised if he misunderstood it. It is a very hard book to read.
Yeah, it's dense reading, for sure, for sure. And Heidegger's criticism of Sartre is that in that formulation that we just brought up of existence is prior to essence, that it in itself, it is still a metaphysical categorization. It's simply replacing the terms, which means that it doesn't really solve the problem. So Sartre is attempting to answer something that he himself still remains captured by. And Heidegger says that's basic, fundamental flaw in your thought, right? When I was engaging you, I was saying that it is nonsensical because you can't escape essence in the fact that you and I can even communicate indicates that there is something over and above the individual that must be in order for communication to even occur. The fact that I can say a thing and that you understand me indicates that there is a component, a transcendental or an essential element that is over and above the individual. That was kind of what I brought up to you. But the Heideggerian critique of Sartre was that in simply reversing the terms, he doesn't escape the metaphysical component itself. He's still stuck within a metaphysical categorization that undercuts his thesis on a fundamental level. And for Heidegger, what he wants to do is look beyond or before the individual and at the question of being itself.
Right. He wants to look at the whole thing rather than just one tiny little part.
Correct. So if we take the word existence from a Heideggerian perspective, he would say, okay, existence itself, it has its prefix is the ek, and then the suffix, which literally means to stand out. And to stand out means that there is something that you are in front of or before. By definition, which means that there's already a context. There is already a world. There is already an encapsulation through which an individual occupies. And it applies culturally, it applies linguistically, it applies ontologically. Your very being, everything that makes you you is never completely separable from this larger environment in which you occupy. That is what Heidegger is interested in. What is that space that you occupy?
Okay.
That's what he's engaged in. The question of being itself as opposed to beings in the world, but that more fundamental aspect. That's what he is focused on. That's what Heidegger wants to develop and explore. Does that work?
Yeah, I think that works.
Okay.
Rereading Letters on Humanism, the letter where he critiques Sartre, there was one quote that really stuck out to me that I wanted to get your opinion on. He says, "When one proclaims God to be the highest value, that is indeed a degradation of God's essence."
Mm-hmm.
What do you think he means by that?
That he's responding to any type of metaphysic that tries to lock in meaning.
Right. Okay.
So he's very critical of the standard philosophical tradition that develops from Plato forward.
Right.
And if you understand the larger intellectual tradition, before Plato, we have what are called the pre-Socratics, which include, say, Heraclitus and Democracy. There's a whole bunch of them, right?
Right.
Thales, all of these individuals, and they are investigating what is reality, what is being. But with Plato, you get an established metaphysic. And once you do that, you have kind of locked in to a dogma that we've referenced earlier. And so Heidegger is saying that dogmas are problematic. Any dogma is by definition going to be gatekeeping. It's going to create a certain epistemic and ontological positioning, right? How do I know and what is that is going to lock in things? And he's going to say
that was his main concern about metaphysics.
Right. And he's saying that all metaphysics are doing that, and it is a mistake. That you have to go more basic. You have to look in how is being manifested, as opposed to I think Heidegger would say, the lazy approach of categorizing and then running through the formula. And so you can't do that. And so in the quote that you referenced, that's what's happening. Is that we are saying, okay, God is X, and now I've laid out a theology, and it's now.
You get that a lot with today, that people like to think of God as the greatest thing there could ever be imagined, but Heidegger would say, no, we need to separate God out of any kind of hierarchy that you're trying to put him in, because that would limit him.
Correct. And so because you like Nietzsche, we can tie this back into Nietzsche. Heidegger was a very big Nietzsche fan. He wrote 4 volumes on Nietzsche.
Okay.
A lot of stuff on Nietzsche. And one of the things that you find with Nietzsche is on a naive reading of his work, he's highly critical of Christianity. A lot of really visceral attacks on Christianity. However,
I've read The Antichrist, so I'm very familiar with his arguments against Christianity.
But you can take I would say almost like 99% of the time, whenever Nietzsche uses the word Christianity, you could replace that with metaphysics and the meaning is completely maintained. That his attack on Christianity is actually an attack on metaphysics. And what he is calling Christianity is basically natural theology, which would be scholasticism, the Neoplatonic tradition that informed medieval intellectual thought all the way up into the Enlightenment. And he's saying that is problematic, that is a flaw. That is what Nietzsche's rhetorical guns are focused on. So it's not necessarily Christianity per se, but it's the metaphysical hubris that developed in these elaborate systems that he's saying are wrong. And Heidegger agrees with him on that. You're saying, yeah, you can't, the metaphysics itself is problematic. The metaphysics itself undercuts the more fundamental question, which goes back to what we were talking about before, is what makes the philosopher the philosopher. It is that humility in trying to understand the virtuous and the true, because that's another thing about in Greek, sophia, wisdom, is tied to the divine. And since we are not divine, that we are simply humans trying to understand the ideal, that we always have to step back. We always have to say, yeah, I'm in this intermediate position and I'm hoping to understand, and this is the way I'm pursuing it, but I can't say that I know. And any metaphysic already by and through that categorization is claiming to know something. And Heidegger is saying that's a mistake.
So when Nietzsche talks about Christianity being a form of slave morality, he's talking about metaphysics. Like you could say metaphysics in general is her mentality. It's slave morality, and it's something that we need to step back from.
Correct. Okay. So I know, again, just going off of your liking of Nietzsche, and you obviously read Thus Spoke Zarathustra.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Think about how the monk is portrayed in that work. Does Nietzsche attack the monk?
He doesn't. No,
he does not.
Why
not?
Metaphysics.
Yeah.
Well, is that would be that's the biggest folly that most people commit these days, is attacking the person rather than the idea itself.
Right. So he's not attacking the devotional life. He's attacking the hubris of making fundamental truth claims within a larger ideology, and he's saying that's the flaw.
Okay.
That's what I think Nietzsche is zeroing in on, and Heidegger would agree with him on that.
Wow. Okay, that is super interesting stuff. That just reframes my whole understanding of Nietzsche. But yeah,
and then think about that in terms of us as members of the restored gospel. I think appreciate that looking at Revelation as an ongoing thing, that there is no closed canon, that there is no silencing of the heavens, that we are in communication, both within the public space where the prophet can speak authoritatively, but also within our own private lives, that the Holy Ghost can tell us things, right? For us and our families that we need. And it is open and it is ongoing and it is dynamic. So that would, if we wanted to give a Nietzschean reading, that's how we could do that. Okay. Right? That we're not locked into a particular thing, but it is expansive, it is dynamic, and it is what it means to be a disciple of Christ.
We don't have creeds.
We don't have creeds. We don't have a locked-in ideology. And as I was saying earlier, I don't think we have a theology either, because we don't have set parameters. Things can change, and they do change. There are instances where we are called to do extraordinarily difficult things, like leave Ur and go off into the wilderness, leave Jerusalem and go off, right? That is part of what it means to be a disciple of Christ, that we're never fixed, that we are tied to a relationship that is above us, and that is where our loyalty lay, not with the ideology.
Right. And then going back to primary school and understanding those primary ideas that we were taught, I definitely think the number one thing you always remember is the "I am a child of God" song. Like that is the one key core idea that you need to always carry with you.
Right. And then taking that, and then if we want to read the Bhagavad Gita, or we want to read the Tao Te Ching, or the Analects of Confucius, or Kierkegaard, or Nietzsche, doesn't matter, right? We come at it from the perspective of a loved son and daughter of God, that we know that that's the case, that the Holy Ghost can speak to us, that the truth can be pursued wherever it lay, and that's all great and wonderful and glorious. And that's what we should do as disciples of Christ. We should not be afraid of the truth. We should actively pursue it. But that pursuit in and of itself, we do not make it an idol. We do not
Right.
say that, okay, I know everything. Now I'm in a position to really teach the brethren what they got wrong.
Okay.
A mistake, right?
Right.
We stay humble. We stay one who is pursuing the good, and the pursuit has value in and through that process.
Mhm.
So you can go back and read Nietzsche a whole bunch of times, or you can read Sartre, or you can read Heidegger or Plato or Aristotle, and there will be something new and wonderful in that, just as we do with the scriptures, right? New things will be brought up to you. And again, it's not just the intellectual tradition. It could be Milton, or it could be Shakespeare. All of those are avenues through which the good and the true and the beautiful can be made manifest. We want to bring in as much of that as we can,
Okay.
while being disciples of Christ.
Okay. Awesome. Well, I think that would be a great closer right then and there. Are there any other anything else you want to bring up?
Nope, I'm good with that.
All right. Well, thank you for your time, and maybe we'll do it again sometime. It's been very intellectually stimulating to think about all of these ideas. I hope that we all feel a little bit more courageous to go out there and explore new and interesting ideas while maintaining that the core central ideas that we were taught in primary school. So thank you.
Thank you,
I hope
Stephen.
you have a great rest of your day. You're out in Orange County where it's beautiful, and so go talk to a pretty girl on the beach or something. I don't know.
Thank you, Stephen. Bye.